The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty parking lot of Riverside Community Bank as David Thompson pulled up in his dark blue sedan. It was 7:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the bank would open its doors to customers. David sat quietly in his car for a moment, looking at the building that now belonged to him. 6 months had passed since he'd purchased this small-town bank, but he still felt a mix of pride and responsibility every time he saw it. David had worked hard to get to this point in his life. Growing up in a working-class family, he'd learned the value of money early. His parents had taught him that success came through education and smart decisions. After college, he'd started a small tech consulting business from his garage. Those late nights fixing computer problems for local businesses had paid off. Within 5 years, he was running a company with 15 employees. But David didn't stop there. He'd always been interested in real estate, so he started buying small properties around town. He would fix them up and rent them out to families who needed affordable housing. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work that helped his community. Over the years, his property portfolio grew, and so did his savings account. When Riverside Community Bank went up for sale, David saw an opportunity. The previous owner, an elderly man named George Patterson, had run the bank for 40 years but was ready to retire. The bank wasn't in bad shape, but it wasn't growing either. David believed he could bring fresh ideas and better technology to help the bank serve the community better. The purchase had taken months of paperwork, meetings with lawyers and negotiations with bank regulators. David had proven his financial stability, his business experience, and his commitment to keeping the bank local rather than selling it to a big corporation. Finally, 3 months ago, the deal was complete. David Thompson was now the owner of Riverside Community Bank. This morning, David had come early because he'd been hearing concerning reports from customers. Some people in town were complaining that the service at the bank had become unfriendly. Others mentioned that the staff seemed distracted or unprofessional. As the new owner, David took these complaints seriously. He believed that good customer service was the foundation of any successful business, especially a bank where people trusted you with their money. David had called ahead and spoken to Helen Carter, the branch manager, several times over the past few weeks. Helen had worked at the bank for 8 years and knew the daily operations better than anyone. During their phone conversations, she had assured him that everything was running smoothly. She explained that some customers were just resistant to change and that the complaints would die down once people got used to the new ownership. But David wasn't convinced. He'd learned in his other businesses that when customers complained, there was usually a real problem that needed attention. That's why he decided to make this surprise visit. He wanted to observe the bank's operations firsthand, without the staff knowing he was coming. This way, he could see how things really worked on a typical day. David checked his watch again. He had 30 more minutes before the bank opened. He used this time to review the complaint letters he'd received. Mrs. Rodriguez had written that a teller had been rude when she tried to make a deposit. Mr. Johnson complained that he'd waited 20 minutes in line even, though there were only 2 people ahead of him. A young mother named Lisa had called to say that the staff had made her feel unwelcome when she brought her baby into the bank. These weren't just isolated incidents. David had received similar complaints from at least a dozen customers over the past month. As someone who prided himself on excellent customer service in his other businesses, these reports troubled him deeply. He knew that word of mouth was everything in a small town like this. If people felt unwelcome at the bank, they would tell their friends and family, and soon the bank would lose customers. David also reviewed the monthly financial reports while he waited. The numbers weren't terrible, but they weren't great either. New account openings were down compared to the same time last year. Several longtime customers had closed their accounts and moved to the bigger bank across town. The loan department was doing okay, but credit card applications were lower than expected. All of these signs pointed to the same conclusion. Something was wrong with the customer experience at Riverside Community Bank. David had tried to address these issues through phone calls and emails with Helen, but clearly a more direct approach was needed. As he sat in his car, David thought about his vision for the bank. He wanted it to be a place where everyone in the community felt welcome, regardless of their background or how much money they had in their account. He remembered how intimidated he'd felt as a young man when he first walked into a bank to open his business account. The teller had looked at him like he didn't belong there, questioning every piece of information on his application. David never wanted any customer to feel that way at his bank. He believed that treating people with respect and kindness wasn't just the right thing to do, it was also good business. Happy customers stayed loyal, brought their friends, and helped spread positive word about the bank throughout the community. At 7:45 a.m., David saw Helen's white SUV pull into the parking lot. She parked near the employee entrance and sat in her car for a few minutes, probably checking her phone or finishing her morning coffee. David watched as she gathered her purse and a stack of papers from her passenger seat. Helen Carter had seemed professional during their phone conversations. She had 20 years of banking experience and good references from her previous jobs. On paper, she was exactly what the bank needed, an experienced manager who understood local customers and banking regulations. But David was starting to wonder if there was more to the story. As Helen walked toward the bank entrance, she noticed David's car in the parking lot. She paused for a moment, looking in his direction with what appeared to be suspicion. Even from a distance, David could see her frown. She seemed to study his car and him for several seconds before continuing toward the building. This reaction surprised David. He was dressed professionally in a navy blue suit and tie, the same outfit he wore to important business meetings. His car was clean and well-maintained, clearly belonging to someone who took care of their possessions. There was nothing about his appearance or vehicle that should have caused concern. David decided to wait a few more minutes before going inside. He wanted to give Helen time to get settled and start her daily routine. He also used this time to prepare himself mentally for what might be a difficult conversation about the bank's customer service issues. Little did David know that his decision to arrive early and observe the bank would lead to one of the most challenging and eye-opening experiences of his life. At exactly 8:15 a.m., David decided it was time to go inside. He had waited long enough, and he wanted to catch the staff during their morning preparations before customers started arriving. He gathered his briefcase, which contained the bank's financial reports and customer complaint letters, and stepped out of his car. The morning air was crisp, and David could hear birds chirping in the oak trees that lined the street. Riverside was the kind of small town where people still waved at each other from their cars, and where the local newspaper featured high school sports scores on the front page. David loved this community atmosphere, which was one of the reasons he'd wanted to keep the bank locally owned rather than let it be bought by a big corporation. As David approached the front entrance, he reached into his jacket pocket for his keys. Among them was the master key to the bank, which George Patterson had given him during the ownership transfer. David had only used this key once before, on the day he'd signed the final paperwork and taken his first official tour of the building as the owner. David inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened smoothly, and he stepped inside the lobby of Riverside Community Bank. The interior was exactly as he remembered it. Marble floors, wooden teller counters, and photographs of the town's history hanging on the walls. The bank had character, unlike the sterile modern branches of the big chain banks. "Excuse me, sir." A sharp voice cut through the quiet morning air. David looked up to see Helen Carter standing behind the main teller counter, her face showing clear alarm and suspicion. She was a woman in her mid-40s with short brown hair and glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Her expression was stern and unwelcoming. "The bank doesn't open until 9 o'clock, Helen continued, her voice growing more authoritative. "You need to leave immediately." David was taken aback by her hostile tone. He set his briefcase down gently on the counter and smiled, trying to diffuse what seemed to be a misunderstanding. "Good morning, Helen. I'm David Thompson. We've spoken several times on the phone about the customer service improvements I wanted to discuss." Helen stared at him blankly for a moment, as if trying to process what he'd just said. But instead of recognition dawning on her face, her expression became even more suspicious. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said firmly. "I've never seen you before in my life. You need to exit this building right now, or I'm going to call security." David felt a knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't how he'd imagined this meeting would go. He'd expected Helen to be surprised by his early arrival, perhaps even a bit embarrassed about being caught off guard, but he hadn't expected this level of hostility and refusal to believe his identity. "Helen, I think there's been a misunderstanding," David said, keeping his voice calm and professional. "I'm the new owner of this bank. I purchased it from George Patterson 3 months ago. You and I have had several phone conversations about bank operations and customer complaints. Helen's eyes narrowed, and she took a step backward. Don't you dare try to lie to me. I know exactly who owns this bank, and it's not you. Now get out before I call the police. David realized that Helen had formed a mental image of what the bank owner should look like based on their phone conversations, and clearly his appearance didn't match her expectations. This was a situation he'd encountered before in his business dealings, though never to this extreme degree. Helen, please, David said, reaching slowly toward his jacket pocket. I have identification right here. I can show you my business cards, my driver's license, and the ownership documents. I also have George Patterson's phone number if you'd like to call him to verify who I am. Don't you dare reach for anything, Helen shouted, her voice echoing off the marble walls. Keep your hands where I can see them. David immediately raised his hands and took a step back from the counter. He could see genuine fear in Helen's eyes, and he knew that any sudden movement could make the situation much worse. His heart was racing, but he forced himself to remain calm. Okay, David said gently. My hands are visible. I'm not reaching for anything. I'm just trying to show you my identification so we can clear up this misunderstanding. But Helen wasn't listening anymore. She had retreated behind the security partition that separated the teller area from the lobby, and David could see her fumbling for something. Probably the phone. This is insane, David thought to himself. I'm standing in my own bank being treated like a criminal by my own employee. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. He'd bought this bank partly because he wanted to ensure that all customers were treated with respect and dignity. Now he was experiencing firsthand what it felt like to be judged and mistrusted based on appearances alone. David tried one more time to reason with Helen. Please, just call the main office. Call Attorney Rodriguez, who handled the acquisition paperwork. Call George Patterson. Call anyone who was involved in the sale. They'll all confirm that I'm David Thompson and I own this bank. Helen shook her head vigorously. I'm not calling anyone except the police. You broke into this bank with what I can only assume are stolen keys. And now you're trying to convince me that you own the place. Do you think I'm stupid? I didn't break in, David replied, his patience beginning to wear thin despite his efforts to stay calm. I used my own key because this is my own building. I'm trying to conduct a surprise inspection of my own business because I've been receiving complaints about customer service. And frankly, I'm starting to understand why. This comment seemed to anger Helen even more. Her face reddened and she pointed an accusatory finger at David. How dare you criticize our customer service? I've been working at this bank for 8 years, and I know exactly how to treat our customers. Unlike some people, I don't go around breaking into buildings and making up stories about owning them. David could hear other staff members arriving for work. The side entrance opened and he heard voices in the employee break room. Soon other employees would witness this confrontation, and David knew that the situation could become even more complicated. Helen, David said, making one final attempt at reason, I understand that my early arrival surprised you. I understand that you might not have expected the new owner to look like me. But I am who I say I am, and I can prove it if you'll just give me a chance. Helen had already picked up the phone. The only thing you're going to prove is that breaking and entering is a serious crime in this state. David felt a mix of anger, frustration, and sadness wash over him. He was angry at being treated like a criminal in his own business. He was frustrated that his attempts to resolve the situation peacefully had failed. But most of all, he was sad that this kind of prejudice and mistrust still existed in his community. As Helen began dialing, David realized that this morning was about to become much more complicated than he'd ever imagined. He was about to experience something that no business owner should ever have to endure. Being arrested in his own establishment by people who refused to believe he belonged there. Helen's hands trembled slightly as she dialed 911. David could hear every beep of the phone buttons in the quiet bank lobby. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to mock the dark turn this situation had taken. David stood perfectly still, his hands visible, knowing that any movement could make things worse. What's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was barely audible to David, but he could hear Helen's response clearly. This is Helen Carter at Riverside Community Bank on Maple Street. I need police here immediately. There's a black male who has broken into our bank using what appear to be stolen keys. He's claiming to be the owner of the bank, which is obviously false. When I confronted him, he reached for something in his jacket, possibly a weapon. David's heart sank as he heard Helen's description. She was painting him as a dangerous criminal, rather than a businessman trying to inspect his own property. The mention of a possible weapon was particularly troubling since he'd only been reaching for his identification. "Ma'am, is the suspect still in the building?" the dispatcher asked. "Yes, he's standing right here in the lobby. I've retreated behind the security barrier, but I'm watching him. He's well-dressed, probably in his 30s, wearing a dark suit. He's about 6 feet tall and carrying a briefcase." David listened to this description of himself with a surreal sense of detachment. It was accurate in terms of his physical appearance and clothing, but the context made it sound sinister. His professional attire, which he'd chosen to look respectable and businesslike, was now being reported as part of a criminal description. "Officers are on their way, ma'am. Can you stay on the line until they arrive?" "Yes, I'll stay on the phone," Helen replied, never taking her eyes off David. David knew he had maybe 5 minutes before the police arrived. He also knew that once they got here, the situation could escalate quickly if he wasn't careful. He'd heard too many stories of misunderstandings that turned tragic when police arrived at a scene where tensions were already high. "Helen," David said quietly, "I'm going to place my briefcase on the floor and step away from it. I'm doing this slowly so you can see that I'm not trying to hide anything or make any threatening moves." He carefully set his briefcase on the marble floor and took 3 steps backward, keeping his hands visible the entire time. "I'm also going to tell you exactly what's in that briefcase," David continued. "It contains financial reports for this bank, customer complaint letters, my business cards, my driver's license, and the ownership transfer documents that George Patterson signed 3 months ago. Everything in there will prove that I'm telling you the truth." Helen remained on the phone with the dispatcher, but David could see a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Maybe it was the calm way he was handling the situation, or maybe it was something in his voice that made her question her assumptions. Just then, the side door opened, and 2 other employees walked in. Janet Miller, a teller in her 50s, and Robert Chen, a loan officer, both stopped in their tracks when they saw the scene in the lobby. "Helen, what's going on?" Janet asked, looking confused and concerned. "Call security," Helen instructed them without taking her eyes off David. "This man broke into the bank and is claiming to be the owner." Robert squinted at David, studying his face. "Wait a minute, Helen. Didn't George show us a picture of the new owner a few months ago? I think he might actually be—" "Don't be ridiculous," Helen cut him off. "I know what the owner looks like, and this isn't him." But Robert continued to stare at David with growing recognition. He'd been at the bank longer than Helen, and had been present during some of the ownership transfer meetings. Unlike Helen, who had primarily communicated with David over the phone, Robert had seen photos and documents with David's picture on them. "Helen, I really think you should look at this more carefully," Robert said cautiously. "Maybe we should call George before the police get here." "The police are already on their way," Helen snapped. "And George is retired. I'm the manager here, and I'm handling this situation." David appreciated Robert's intervention, but he could see that Helen was too committed to her version of events to change course now. She'd made the 911 call, told the dispatcher that David was a criminal, and now she couldn't back down without admitting she'd made a terrible mistake. "Robert's right, Helen," David said gently. "If you call George Patterson right now, he'll tell you exactly who I am. His number is in my phone, which is in my jacket pocket. I can give you the number if you don't have it." "I'm not calling anyone," Helen replied firmly, "and I'm not letting you reach for anything else. You've already tried to pull something out of your jacket once." Through the front windows, David could see a police car turning into the parking lot. His stomach tightened as he realized that the next few minutes would be crucial. He'd never been arrested before, and he certainly never expected his first encounter with police as a suspect would happen in his own business. "Listen carefully," David said to all 3 employees. "When the police come in, I'm going to cooperate fully with them. I'm going to follow their instructions exactly, but I need all of you to know that this is a misunderstanding that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Stop trying to manipulate us," Helen said, though her voice sounded less confident than before. "I'm not trying to manipulate anyone," David replied. "I'm trying to prevent a situation where innocent people get hurt, including you, Helen. Do you understand what will happen if the police discover that you called in a false report about your own boss?" This comment seemed to shake Helen's confidence further. She glanced at Robert and Janet, both of whom were looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Maybe we should just check his identification, Janet suggested quietly. What harm could it do to look at his driver's license? Because he could be reaching for a weapon instead of a wallet, Helen replied. But her voice lacked conviction. Does he look like someone who's about to attack 3 people with a gun? Robert asked. He's been standing there calmly for 10 minutes. If he wanted to hurt us, wouldn't he have done it by now? The police car had parked and David could see 2 officers getting out. They were moving quickly but not running, which suggested they'd been told this was a break-in rather than a violent crime in progress. This is your last chance, Helen, David said urgently. Call George Patterson right now. Call him before those officers walk through that door. Once they come in here and I'm treated like a criminal in front of other employees, this becomes a much bigger problem for everyone involved. Helen looked at the phone in her hand, then at the approaching police officers, then back at David. For a moment, David thought she might actually make the call, but then she shook her head decisively. Nice try, she said, but I'm not falling for your games. The front door of the bank opened and Officers Martinez and Johnson stepped inside. They immediately assessed the scene. Helen behind the security barrier with a phone in her hand, David standing in the middle of the lobby with his hands visible, and 2 other employees looking confused and worried. Are you the lady who called about a break-in? Officer Martinez asked Helen. Yes, that's him right there, Helen pointed at David. He broke in using stolen keys and claimed to own the bank. When I confronted him, he tried to reach for something in his jacket. Officer Johnson looked at David, taking in his professional appearance and calm demeanor. Something about the situation didn't seem quite right to him, but he had to follow protocol. Sir, I'm going to need you to put your hands behind your head and turn around slowly, Officer Johnson instructed. David's heart was pounding, but he followed the instruction exactly. As he turned around, he caught a glimpse of Robert's face, which showed clear distress and confusion. David realized that regardless of how the situation ended, his relationship with his employees would never be the same. Officer Martinez approached David slowly, his hand resting on his service weapon but not drawing it. The officer had 15 years of experience and had learned to read situations carefully. Something about this scene didn't add up to a typical break-in. Sir, what's your name? Officer Martinez asked as he moved behind David. David Thompson, David replied calmly, keeping his hands behind his head. I'm the owner of this bank. He's lying, Helen called out from behind the security barrier. I'm the manager here and I've never seen this man before in my life. Officer Johnson walked over to Helen while his partner continued questioning David. Ma'am, can you tell me exactly what happened this morning? I arrived for work around 7:45, Helen began, her words coming out in a rush. When I got here, I saw this suspicious man sitting in a car in our parking lot. Then at about 8:15, he somehow got inside the bank using keys that he must have stolen or duplicated. When I told him the bank was closed, he claimed to be the owner and reached for something in his jacket. Did you actually see a weapon? Officer Johnson asked. Well, no, but he was definitely reaching for something threatening, and his whole story about owning the bank is obviously fake. I mean, look at him. Officer Johnson glanced at David, trying to understand what Helen meant by that last comment. David was well-dressed, articulate, and cooperating fully with police instructions. If anything, he looked more like a businessman than a criminal. Meanwhile, Officer Martinez was carefully searching David for weapons. Sir, I'm going to check your jacket pockets. Do you have anything sharp or dangerous that might hurt me? No weapons, David replied. In my right jacket pocket, you'll find my wallet with my driver's license and business cards. In the left pocket, I have my cell phone and car keys, including the key to this bank. Officer Martinez carefully removed the items from David's pockets and examined them. The driver's license clearly showed David Thompson's name and photograph. The business cards identified him as the owner of Thompson Tech Consulting and Thompson Property Management. Among the keys was one that looked like it could fit the bank's front door. Ma'am, Officer Martinez called to Helen, do you have a business card or contact information for the actual owner of this bank? I can get you George Patterson's number, Robert Chen interjected, speaking up for the first time since the police arrived. He's the previous owner who sold the bank a few months ago. Don't listen to him, Helen said quickly. Robert doesn't know what he's talking about. But Officer Martinez was already interested in Robert's suggestion. He'd noticed that Robert seemed less certain about the situation than Helen, and the loan officer's willingness to provide a contact number suggested he might have important information. Sir, Are you an employee here too? Martinez asked Robert. Yes, I'm a loan officer. I've worked here for 12 years. I was present during some of the ownership transfer meetings, and I'm pretty sure this gentleman is actually David Thompson, the new owner. Helen's face flushed red. Robert, you're out of line. I'm the manager, and I'm telling you that this man is not our owner. Then why don't we just call George and ask him? Robert replied, his confidence growing. It'll take 2 minutes to clear this up. Officer Martinez looked at his partner, who nodded in agreement. This was exactly the kind of verification they needed to resolve the situation. Ma'am, I think that's a good idea. Officer Martinez said to Helen, Can you provide us with the previous owner's phone number so we can verify Mr. Thompson's identity? Helen hesitated. She realized she was trapped. If she provided George's number and he confirmed David's identity, she would be exposed as having made a false police report. But if she refused to provide the number, it would look suspicious. I don't have his number memorized, Helen said weakly. It's in the office phone directory, Janet offered helpfully. She'd been watching the entire scene with growing concern and was eager to resolve the confusion. Officer Martinez asked Janet to retrieve the directory, and within moments she returned with George Patterson's contact information. The officer used his radio to ask dispatch to call George and verify the identity of the bank's current owner. This is ridiculous, Helen muttered. You're all being fooled by an elaborate con man. While they waited for the verification call, Officer Martinez continued examining David's identification and documents. Everything appeared legitimate. The driver's license was genuine. The business cards looked professional, and the keys included what appeared to be a master key for the building. Mr. Thompson, can you tell me how you acquired ownership of this bank? Officer Martinez asked. David, still standing with his hands behind his head, began explaining the purchase process. He described the months of negotiations with George Patterson, the involvement of lawyers and bank regulators, and the final transfer of ownership 3 months earlier. His account was detailed and consistent, including specific names, dates, and legal procedures that would be difficult to fake. And why did you come to the bank so early this morning? Officer Johnson asked. I'd been receiving customer complaints about poor service, David explained. I wanted to observe the morning operations without the staff knowing I was coming. I thought a surprise inspection would help me understand what was really happening. Well, you certainly got a surprise, Officer Martinez said with a slight smile. The radio crackled, and dispatch came back with the verification results. Unit 47, I spoke with George Patterson. He confirms that David Thompson is the current owner of Riverside Community Bank. Mr. Patterson expressed shock and concern about the situation and asked if Mr. Thompson needs any assistance. The silence in the bank lobby was deafening. Helen's face went white and she sank onto a stool behind the teller counter. Robert looked relieved while Janet shook her head in disbelief. Officer Martinez immediately began removing the handcuffs from David's wrists. Mr. Thompson, I apologize for the inconvenience. You're free to go, obviously. This appears to have been a case of mistaken identity. David rubbed his wrists and turned around to face the group. His expression was a mixture of relief, disappointment, and sadness. He looked at Helen, who couldn't meet his eyes. Helen, David said quietly, I tried to tell you who I was. I offered to show you identification, to call George, to call the lawyers who handled the sale. Why didn't you believe me? Helen remained silent, staring at the floor. Ma'am, Officer Johnson addressed Helen. Do you understand that filing a false police report is a serious offense? You called 911 and reported a break-in when in fact the building's owner was using his own key to enter his own property. I didn't know, Helen said weakly. He didn't look like what? David asked, though he already knew the answer. I don't know what I thought, Helen replied, but everyone in the room understood exactly what had happened. Officer Martinez closed his notebook and prepared to leave. Mr. Thompson, do you want to press charges for filing a false police report? David considered the question carefully. He was angry and humiliated, but he also knew that pressing charges would create even more problems for his business and his community. He looked around at his employees, all of whom were watching him intently. Not at this time, David said finally, but I'm going to need to have some serious conversations with my staff about what happened here this morning. As the police officers prepared to leave, Officer Martinez pulled David aside. Sir, I've been doing this job for 15 years and I've seen situations like this before. What happened here today wasn't really about mistaken identity. You know that, right? David nodded. I know exactly what this was about. For what it's worth, Officer Martinez continued, you handled it perfectly. You stayed calm, followed instructions, and didn't let the situation escalate. A lot of people wouldn't have been able to do that. Thank you, officer, David replied. I appreciate your professionalism. After the police left, David found himself alone in his bank with 3 employees who had just witnessed one of the most embarrassing and revealing moments of his professional life. The question now was what to do next. The silence in the bank lobby stretched on for what felt like an eternity. David stood near the front door, still processing what had just happened. Helen remained behind the teller counter, her face pale and her hands shaking. Robert and Janet exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of what to say or do. David walked over to where he'd placed his briefcase on the floor and picked it up. His movements were calm and deliberate, but everyone in the room could sense the tension beneath his composed exterior. Helen, David said finally, I think you should go home for the day. Helen looked up at him with tears in her eyes. Mr. Thompson, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I know what you thought, David replied, his voice steady but not unkind. And that's exactly the problem we need to address. Helen gathered her purse and jacket, moving slowly like someone in shock. As she walked toward the exit, she stopped and turned back to David. Are you going to fire me? She asked quietly. David was quiet for a long moment, considering his response carefully. Helen, I'm going to think about everything that happened here this morning. We'll talk tomorrow after we've both had time to process this. After Helen left, David turned to Robert and Janet, who were still standing awkwardly in the employee area. I want you both to know that I'm not angry with either of you, David said. Robert, I appreciate that you tried to speak up and suggest calling George. Janet, thank you for helping get his contact information. Robert stepped forward, looking visibly relieved. Mr. Thompson, I'm really sorry about what happened. I should have spoken up sooner. I recognized you from the photos George showed us, but I let Helen take charge of the situation. You did speak up, David replied. And that took courage, especially when your manager was telling you to stay quiet. Janet nodded in agreement. We've all heard stories about things like this happening at other businesses, but I never thought I'd see it at our bank. I feel terrible that you had to go through that. David set his briefcase on the counter and opened it, pulling out the customer complaint letters he'd brought to discuss with Helen. Actually, this morning's events help explain some of the problems we've been having, David said, spreading the letters on the counter. I came here early because I'd received numerous complaints about poor customer service. Now I'm starting to understand what some of our customers might be experiencing. Robert picked up one of the letters and read it. Mrs. Washington says a teller was rude to her and made her feel unwelcome. Mr. Davis writes that he felt like he was being watched suspiciously the entire time he was in the bank. If Helen treated me, the owner of the bank, with suspicion and hostility based on my appearance, how do you think she's been treating customers who look like me? David asked. The implications of his question hung heavy in the air. Janet covered her mouth with her hand as the full scope of the problem became clear. Oh my goodness, she whispered. How many customers have we lost because of this? David spent the next 2 hours talking with Robert and Janet about the bank's customer service issues. They reviewed the complaint letters together and discussed specific incidents they'd witnessed but hadn't fully understood at the time. Robert recalled a day when Helen had followed a young, black father around the bank while he conducted his business, claiming she was just being thorough. Janet remembered several occasions when Helen had asked for extra identification from certain customers, even for routine transactions. I thought she was just being careful about security, Janet admitted, but now I see there was a pattern to which customers she treated differently. By 10 a.m., regular customers were starting to arrive for their banking needs. David decided to stay and observe the morning operations, which had been his original plan. What he saw confirmed his worst fears about the bank's culture. The first customer was Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly Latina woman who came in to deposit her Social Security check. Janet served her with kindness and efficiency, but David noticed how Mrs. Rodriguez kept glancing around nervously, as if she expected someone to challenge her right to be there. The next customer was a young black man in work clothes who wanted to cash his paycheck. Even with Helen gone, David could see how the remaining staff unconsciously treated him differently. They asked for additional identification, counted his money twice, and spoke to him in slower, more deliberate tones as if he might not understand normal conversation. David realized that Helen's behavior hadn't existed in a vacuum. It had created a culture where certain assumptions and treatments had become normalized throughout the bank. Around noon, David called an emergency staff meeting with all bank employees. Word had already spread about the morning's incident, and the full staff of 8 people gathered in the conference room with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. "I want everyone to hear directly from me what happened this morning," David began, and he proceeded to give a calm, factual account of the events. He didn't dramatize or exaggerate, but he didn't minimize the seriousness of what had occurred either. When he finished, the room was silent. Finally, Patricia, one of the senior tellers, spoke up. "Mr. Thompson, some of us have been concerned about certain practices for a while, but we didn't know how to address them without seeming like troublemakers." "What kind of practices?" David asked. Patricia exchanged glances with several other employees before answering. "Helen had unofficial policies about watching certain customers more closely. She called it enhanced security protocols, but we all knew it only applied to customers of certain backgrounds." David felt a mix of anger and sadness as he listened to his employees describe a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been going on for months. Customers had been asked for unnecessary additional identification. Some had been followed around the bank lobby. Others had been made to wait longer than necessary while their transactions were verified. "Why didn't anyone report this to the main office or to George Patterson?" David asked. "Helen told us these were standard banking security procedures," explained Tom, a newer teller. "Those of us who questioned it were told we didn't understand proper risk management." David realized that Helen had used her position of authority to normalize discriminatory practices and silence dissent among the staff. Effective immediately. "We're going to make some changes," David announced. "First, Helen Carter is no longer employed by this bank. Her termination is not just because of this morning's incident, but because of a pattern of behavior that has damaged our reputation and violated our values." Several employees looked relieved at this news. "Second, we're going to implement mandatory training for all staff on customer service, diversity, and unconscious bias. This training will be conducted by professionals, and attendance will be required for continued employment." David went on to outline a comprehensive plan for cultural change at the bank. He established clear customer service standards that applied equally to all customers, regardless of their appearance or background. He created an anonymous reporting system for employees to raise concerns about discriminatory practices. He also announced plans for community outreach, programs to rebuild trust with customers who had been poorly treated. "I want Riverside Community Bank to be a place where every person in our community feels welcome and respected," David said. "That's not just good morals, it's good business. Banks succeed when they serve their entire community well." Over the following weeks, David worked tirelessly to transform the bank's culture. He personally called every customer who had filed a complaint, apologizing for their poor treatment and inviting them to give the bank another chance. Many were surprised to hear from the owner directly, and most agreed to return. The bias training sessions were eye-opening for many employees. They learned to recognize their unconscious assumptions and developed better strategies for treating all customers equally. David also implemented new policies that removed subjective judgment from routine banking procedures. The changes weren't without challenges. 2 employees who were uncomfortable with the new expectations chose to leave for jobs elsewhere. Some longtime customers questioned why the bank was making such a big deal about customer service policies. But the positive changes far outweighed the negatives. New customers began opening accounts as word spread about the bank's commitment to respectful service. The anonymous reporting system allowed employees to address concerns before they became major problems. Customer satisfaction scores improved dramatically over the course of 6 months. Local media eventually picked up the story of what had happened that morning in March. Rather than hiding from the publicity, David used it as an opportunity to talk about the importance of confronting bias in business settings. He became a speaker at business conferences, sharing his experience and encouraging other business owners to examine their own company cultures. A year later, Riverside Community Bank had grown its customer base by 30% and had been recognized by the State Banking Commission for outstanding customer service. David often reflected that while he never wanted to experience that humiliating morning again, it had ultimately led to something more valuable than he'd initially imagined, a business that truly served all members of its community with dignity and respect. The incident had taught him that good intentions weren't enough. Creating an inclusive environment required active effort, ongoing vigilance, and the courage to confront difficult truths about bias and discrimination. Most importantly, it had shown him that how a business responds to problems often matters more than the problems themselves. David kept a photo on his desk from the bank's one-year anniversary celebration, showing employees and customers of all backgrounds celebrating together in the lobby where he'd once been handcuffed. It served as a daily reminder that positive change was possible, even in the face of the most challenging circumstances.